Welcome to Get Your FRQ On. This is from the 2003 exam. It is question 5, and it is not calculator active. In the question stem, we are given that there is a cylindrical coffee pot with radius of 5 inches, and the coffee in the pot, the volume of that coffee is decreasing at a rate of negative 5 pi times the square root of h, where h is the height of the coffee. In part A, we are asked to show that dH dt is negative square root of h all over 5. Since the coffee pot is a cylinder, we know that the volume of that coffee pot is pi r squared times h. We also know that the volume of coffee in the coffee pot will be pi r squared times the height of the coffee, and since the radius of our coffee pot is 5, the volume of coffee in the coffee pot is 25 pi times h. We're also given that dV dt is negative 5 pi times the square root of h. However, since we know the volume of the cylinder in terms of h, we should be able to use implicit differentiation here to come up with a formula for dV dt based on the fact that the volume is 25 pi h. So, if dV dt is negative 5 times the square root of h, and the derivative of 25 pi h is just going to be 25 pi times dH dt, those two rates have to be the same. It's the same coffee pot. So dV dt, if it's equal to both of those expressions must be equal to each other, so we get the equation negative 5 pi square root h equals 25 pi dH dt. From here, it's a little simple algebra to show that dH dt is negative square root of h all over 5 as required. In part B, we are given an initial condition that h is 17 when t is equal to 0, and then asked to solve the differential equation dH dt equals negative square root h over 5 for h. Okay. First thing we're going to want to notice with this question is that the differential equation dH dt equals negative square root h over 5 is separable, which means that we can solve it using separation of variables. And typically on the AP exam, if you have a free response question that requires you to solve a differential equation, and that differential equation is separable, you are almost always required to use separation of variables in order to solve it. If you don't use separation of variables or you use some other method, you can either lose all the points or not earn any of the points, or maybe earn 1 out of 4 or 5 for a question like this. If the differential equation is solvable using separation of variables, the expectation is that you will use separation of variables. So we set this up. We have dH dt is equal to negative square root h over 5. This implies that dH over the square root of h is negative 1/5 dt. That implies that h to the minus 1/2 dH is negative 1/5 dt. And I can just take the indefinite integral of both sides. So now we have the indefinite integral of h to the 1/2 dH. H to the negative 1/2 dH equals the integral of negative 1/5 dt. All right, if that is true, do a little bit of calculus and we can determine that 2h to the 1/2 is equal to negative 1/5 t plus the constant. Now, we're given an initial condition, h is 17 when t is equal to 0. So in order to solve this for h, we will have to know the value of c, and we're going to use the initial condition in order to determine the value of c. So if I plug in 17 for h and 0 in for t, 2 times 17 to the 1/2 equals negative 1/5 of 0 plus c, implies that c is equal to 2 times the square root of 17. So if I know that c is equal to 2 times the square root of 17, I can plug that into the equation I got up here for c, and then solve for h. H turns out to be negative 1/10 t plus the square root of 17, all squared. In part C, we are asked to determine at what time the coffee pot will be empty. The coffee pot will be empty when the height of the coffee in it is 0. So we just have to figure out, well, when will the height be 0? Well, we know that h is given by negative 1/10 t plus the square root of 17 squared. So h will be 0 when negative 1/10 t plus the square root of 17 squared is 0, which of course will only happen if negative 1/10 t plus the square root of 17 is 0. Do the algebra. This implies that the square root of 17 is equal to 1/10 of t, which means that the coffee pot will be empty at t times the square root of 17 seconds.